All right. Well, we're not in the confession tonight in the sense of we're not in the articles of the confession, but we're in the background of the confession and thinking very much about the men who shaped this, who God used to do this great work. And I've mentioned there are many books that are coming into our library pretty much this Sunday and forward that will cover these lives. And so you can certainly follow and read more if you want to dig deeper into these men and their lives, but quite fascinating. And they lived in a very fascinating time. We've spoken about oftentimes God raises up a single person to do a great work. I mean, it's never just a single person, but we think about like 1517 Luther as being kind of head and shoulders in that moment, the guy driving the bus. But there are other times where it's a group of people. We often talk about in the colonial America, that gathering of all those amazing minds that became the founding fathers. It was more like that with the Baptists. It wasn't just one guy here or one guy there, but an incredible group of men that emerged having very similar convictions all around the same time in very difficult circumstances. And so we want to see that tonight as we look primarily at the Broken Wharf Church. And that, of all the churches of the confession or behind the confession that signed the confession, the Broken Wharf Church is probably the name people are most familiar with today, if only because there's a publisher now called Broken Wharf Publishers that put out Baptist resources. But the Broken Wharf Church was an important church. It was a leading church in England of the Baptist churches in that day. And its first and really greatest pastor was the man we want to focus on tonight, primarily Hanserd Knollys, or Knowles. It depends. There's different pronunciations. But this man was one of the most important Baptists in those earliest days. And we want to talk tonight about why that is and why the Broken Wharf Church was so important historically, although there's not a lot we can say because there's not a lot of records on the church itself outside of just about Knollys or himself. So anyway, beginning, he was born in Lincolnshire in England in 1598. There's some debate on when he was born exactly. Records weren't great back then. Buildings would burn down, and that was all the records. In fact, I had a grandmother whose birth record didn't exist because the courthouse had burnt down, and so there was no way to prove exactly what her age was in that day. And so we see similar things happen in time. There's some debate about his age, but William Kiffin, one of the other great early Baptists, had known him for like 60 years and said he was definitely 91 years old when he died, and therefore it helps us to know it was probably about 1598, which is what most people hold to. He was the son of Richard Knowles, or Knollys. I'm going to settle on one of these along the way, and we'll just go with it. But his father was the resident clergy of the Church of England for that district in which he lived. And was, as most Church of England ministers was, he was very much about the work that he was involved in. He wanted his son to grow up in the church and to have a good education being important, probably hoping he would follow along in the ministry after him. And so his early life was focused on education, private tutors, private schooling, the better public schools when that was available. He became proficient as a child in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, which was not unusual in that time if you were coming from an educated family, but amongst the early Baptists, it was unusual. There weren't many scholarly early Baptists in the earliest days, and so it's going to set him apart as kind of an important figure. In his middle teen years, he was accepted to St. Catherine's College at Cambridge, and he had as a classmate Thomas Goodwin, the great Puritan Congregationalist. So they shared a lot of time together, and they shared a lot of experience and even outlook eventually, as of course Knowles will also be a Congregationalist as a Baptist. While there, he began to be introduced to Puritan theology, and he really kind of found an affinity for it, right? He was like, this is good stuff. He's like, why would we not want to see the church purified, right? And its doctrine, its practices. Why would we not want a pure church? And he began to see some problems in talking to the Puritans at Cambridge, saw some of the problems of the Church of England. And so these were much of the debates going on at the time, of course, with the separatists and so on and so forth. And so He's involved in all of these debates at Cambridge. He's hearing the best arguments on every side because the smartest people were at Cambridge at this time. And so it was an interesting few years. He graduates and becomes the schoolmaster of the free school in Gainsborough. This is a really important thing. He began to be known as one of the best educators in all of England. This is going to be something that's going to be very important to him as a Baptist minister because there's going to be a number of times where he's basically broke. And he returns to being a teacher or a schoolmaster or a tutor to earn some money on the side. And oftentimes he has great success in that avenue and has to choose to continue it or focus on ministry. So it's an interesting story there. But one of the sharpest minds. In June of 29, the bishop of his region ordained him as a deacon. He saw in him, he'd heard him preach, he saw in him some gifts, he made him a deacon, and the next day ordained him as a presbyter. And I thought, well, this is strange. One day as a deacon, the next day as a presbyter, except that's what happened with Kiffin and several others. So it may have been a regular practice to, before you can be an elder, you first have to be a deacon at that time. I haven't been able to research that. But it doesn't seem to be uncommon to be ordained as a deacon one day and the very next day ordained as a presbyter. Whatever the case, he begins to preach. He's very popular in his preaching. He's fiery in his preaching and very committed to preaching. And he begins to preach about 4 times a week. And this is, people are coming to hear him preach. And it's a really a time of, I guess, development for him theologically as well. He begins to be convicted of some things that are going on in the Anglican Church. And he has been for a long time. But, you know, it's kind of theoretical before. When you're at Cambridge, it's theoretical. Now it's like, do I walk away from a job? Do I walk away from earning money? What do I do? And so these things are on his mind as he's preaching regularly. Let's try to make it 1631, not 1931. 1631 is kind of a year of great change for him because he gets married. Marries a lady named Anne Cheney, who he speaks very highly of. That's, again, it's not necessarily commonplace for men at this time to mention their wives much in their writings, but he did. He was very fond of his wife. And just to give you a little bit of a taste of it, Tom Nettles, in his biography on Knollys, records this from the writings of Knollys. He says, "The next year I married a wife, with whom I have lived 40 years, by whom I have 7 sons and 3 daughters, who was a wholly discreet woman." That's not W-H, but H-O-L-Y, right? Wholly discreet woman, and a meet help for me in the ways of her household, and also in the way of holiness, who was my companion in all my sufferings, travels, and hardships that I endured for the gospel. She departed this life April 30th, 1671, in full assurance of eternal life and salvation. Again, it's not abnormal to have those kind of writings in this period. I mean, Luther certainly wrote about Katie Luther, you know, how much he loved her and needed her. But, you know, I think it says a lot about maybe what's going on in his life, how much his wife was an aid in his development in holiness, because it's right after his marriage that he begins to say, I need to leave the Anglican Church. And so how much of an input she had in this, or maybe his fear of leaving because it would put their finances in jeopardy, and she said, don't worry about that, you need to do what you think is right. Whatever the case, it's in that same year that he goes to the bishop and says, I need to resign my position as an Anglican. And the priest asks him the reasons, and the reasons are recorded as things like the wearing of the ministerial surplice he didn't like, the sign of the cross at baptism he thought was extra. And then on top of that, the biggest problem he had was the nature of the Anglican Church, which we've talked about before, the argument that all English citizens are members of the Anglican Church proper, and therefore are members of the church proper, and therefore in communion. And he saw that as a real problem. He said, there are people who are clearly wicked, living wicked lives, that they come in here and we're supposed to serve them communion. And he said, this is a problem. So again, all this is going on in his mind and causing him difficulties with the nature of a state church and the nature of a church that does not reflect a body of believers, of clear believers. And so already we can see that Congregationalist and even Baptist distinctive shaping. Well, the bishop does not want him to resign. The bishop likes him personally, They'd had discussions before about some places where he might be at odds slightly with the Anglican Church, and convinces him again, even if you resign your position, stay preaching. And if there's things you don't want to preach, you have a conscience issue against them, preach what's with your conscience. Preach what you can preach. Preach freely. And so that's what he does. For 2 more years, he preaches until around 1633, 1634. Again, these dates are sometimes debated. But in that length of time, somewhere in there, he basically is disillusioned. He has this kind of identity crisis, begins to question whether or not his ordination is sound because it's Anglican. One biographer says of this, it seems that what really was at the heart of this was he was hearing other Puritan preachers preach, gospel preaching, and he realized he didn't fully know their gospel. And that somewhere within this, there was something that wasn't clicking. He was bothered. He knew that he shouldn't be preaching if he couldn't preach as they did. And so he went back and said, I can't preach anymore. I've got to give it up until I know God has called me to do this, and I know what I'm supposed to preach. I'm not going to get in the pulpit again. So this is a crisis for him for a week or so until he goes to see a man, a well-known Puritan preacher in the area, John Wheelwright, who at the time was very famous, very controversial, bold preacher, preaching the gospel. And he goes to him and he basically says, I need your help. Like, I just feel something's wrong. Help me out with this. And so Wheelwright becomes something of a mentor to him, but right off the bat interviews him and tells him, which would be quite startling, I think, to hear. He said, you are a preacher of the covenant of works and you know nothing of the covenant of grace. Now that's pretty much a slap in the face, but a helpful slap in the face if it's true, right? So Knowles immediately begins to go and pray and meditate and fast and all the things that he can think to do, searching the scriptures. And finally in Isaiah, after a few weeks of all this, in Isaiah, he says he discovers the grace of God proclaimed in simply believing. And almost immediately then gets back to preaching again and preaches with even more fire. And people seem to notice this. In fact, the authorities begin to notice it because now we're into like the mid-1630, 1634, 1635. And Archbishop Laud is cracking down on behalf of Charles I on all nonconformist preachers. And so generally speaking, the ones that caught their attention were the ones that got arrested. And so Knowles is one who gets their attention. He is preaching in such a way that it's impossible not to notice him because it's fiery and it's precise in its doctrine. And so they send a constable to arrest him with an arrest warrant. And they come in to arrest him in the middle of his sermon. And so anyway, they come up, and while he's preaching, they wrestle his hands behind him and put handcuffs on him. And as they're trying to drag him out of the pulpit, he basically stops them and somehow convinces them to let him go. I've heard reports of something more or less like, you don't want to arrest a man in the middle of preaching. You don't want to disrupt. What if you're wrong? You know, what if this is a service God would want and you're disrupting it? How will God judge you? Whatever the case, it seems the constable let him go. And with the plans of maybe arresting him the next day or the day after that when he's not preaching. So Hanserd Knollys goes home, packs his bags, gets his wife, gets his child, gets down to the port, gets on a boat sailing to Boston, right? I'm getting out of here. I'm not going to go to jail. They were already hearing that Archbishop Laud was throwing the book at people. I mean, we're talking about long, long sentences. So he was like, I'll go to the New World. I'll go to Boston. I'll go there and live and preach the gospel there. He wasn't original in this. His mentor, John Wheelwright, had just done this about 7 months earlier. He had gotten in trouble with the authorities in Laud's very earliest days. He was kind of marked out very early on as a troublemaker, so they went after him first. So he got on the boat and went to Boston. And so now he's just following him sometime later. Actually, about the same time, another very important Baptist who we'll come back and mention again in a week or two, Thomas Patient, also got on a boat about that same time and came to Boston. So you had this kind of influx of these British Baptists. They weren't all Baptists at this point, but they're coming over, and Wheelwright certainly was more of a independent, but they're coming over, and the reason that, and this is important to note, that Wheelwright chose Boston was he was married to a woman who had connections in Boston, and in fact, it instead of coming to a place where they're going to have peace and rest and an easier time, they kind of go out of the frying pan into the fire because his wife's sister is Anne Hutchinson, which may or may not mean something to you, but she was a huge figure of controversy in America at that time because she began to go around in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and began to say, all the preachers here are preachers of works righteousness. And her husband, William Hutchinson, was obviously along for the argument, but for some reason she became kind of the figurehead or the noted one about it. And I think the reason is, whether or not she really was, it was able to make it controversial if it's a woman going around accusing the clergy rather than a man. But I would say it was probably both of them doing this. And there were other people that agreed with them, certainly at that time. But they became kind of the figureheads. And so, of course, Wheelwright, when he gets there, is very much going to be in agreement with this. He is a devout preacher of salvation by grace through Christ alone. And so he's there jumping right in saying, from what I hear, she's right. This is a works-based preaching. You're not saved by showing up to church services and by giving a certain amount and by doing all these things that the ministers are saying to do. This is what's known in the Massachusetts Bay Colony as the antinomian controversy, because this group, the Hutchinsons, and then, of course, all these people coming over from Britain are called antinomians because they're saying, well, you want us to follow none of the law, which isn't true. We see from all their preaching that they were very much saying it's important that we do what is right and fitting and leads to holiness. Just realize you're not saved by that. You're saved by grace. But it was controversial, caused a huge uproar, and one by one they got in trouble. So it started with Wheelwright. He was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. For the first year or so that he was there, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a very important figure, a man named Governor Vane, he was the governor. He ended up going back to England and being a major figure in the period where Oliver Cromwell ruled. He was one of Cromwell's childhood friends and was a childhood friend of Wheelwright as well. And so he kept interceding on their behalf in their legal problems in Boston until he was voted out of office because of these very controversies. And he went back to England and became an important figure there. In fact, one of the only people that Charles II had executed when he retook power was Vane. And it's an interesting story on why that is. We might get into it a little bit more, because these stories are really important and they're never told anymore. But I think it really had to do with Charles II wanted his estate and his money. We'll see that Charles II was desperate for money when he retook the throne. In fact, he goes to William Kiffin, who we'll look at, and he asks him for a loan of 40,000 pounds. Now think for a moment what 40,000 pounds would have been in 1661. So again, tremendous amount. So anyway, regardless, Vane has his part to play in this saga at this point. He's defending this group, but as he loses power, now there's no one to defend them. Wheelwright is cast out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he goes up to Exeter in New Hampshire and founds that area, that town, and begins to be a preacher there. And then next, the Hutchinsons are kicked out, and Roger Williams hears about them in Rhode Island and invites them to come down and found a town in Rhode Island. And so in a weird way, just like in the book of Acts, all these people being expelled out of their Jerusalem, which is Boston, they end up planting new independent congregations and cities all over New England. Knollys was about to get in trouble. There was about to be an arrest warrant put out for him when another community in New Hampshire said, will you come up here and preach? And he went up there and preached for a while. And then his father got sick in 1641 and he returned to England. When he got back to England, he was broke, absolutely broke. And So what did he do? He began to teach again, and he started a school at St. Mary's Axe. That's a really interesting location in England. It's the financial district today. It was an important district then as well. Our Sunday school literature, our little book on the Gospel of John, you may notice it's published by St. Helens of Bishopgate, which is one of the great Anglican churches to this day. Very conservative, sound, evangelical Anglican church. That is right there in St. Mary's Axe in the financial district. In fact, that church, which is the oldest church in London, was heavily damaged by an IRA bomb when they tried to blow up the financial district in the 1990s. But anyway, he starts a school there. Within a couple of weeks, he has 140 students. Again, this tells you the draw for his talents and how much it was needed at that time. He closes the school after 6 months or so because he'd earned some money, got some money in his pocket, and the Civil War had begun. And he wanted to support Parliament, so he enlisted on Parliament's side in the Parliamentary Army as a chaplain and became very disillusioned with that very quickly because he said all the commanders were vile, evil men who didn't keep their word and didn't live like Christians. And he said, I can't do this anymore. So he left and he went back to London. And there he joined, now I'm asking you to refer back to like week 1, the JLJ Church, which was an amazing kind of puritanical, independent congregation in London. It's named after Jacob, Lathrop, and Jesse, the first 3 pastors of the church, an independent Congregationalist church. And the church that if you weren't an Anglican and you weren't a Presbyterian, if you were looking for something independent where different views could kind of all coexist, that was the church you went to. And so he goes there in 1641. And gets very involved in that church. A very talented man. It's noticed that he's very talented. He probably is ministering in some way in that congregation. But over a couple of years, and we don't exactly know how this was proceeding because there's not a lot written about it, he becomes convinced that paedobaptism is wrong, that it's not scriptural, and that it could be reading other people who are writing on these things and wrestling with these things at the time. But whatever the case, he goes to Henry Jesse, the pastor of the church, and just says, listen, I've got a baby that's about to be born, and many people in our church would say I need to baptize that child, but I'm not convinced. Can you convince me, first of all? And Henry Jesse would try to make arguments because Henry Jesse was kind of riding the fence on this issue for a number of years. And Jesse's arguments were more or less seemed to be being refuted by Knollys. So they said, well, let's just have a church-wide debate. And they brought the congregation together, and people on both sides got up kind of very collegially and ironically arguing these things. It wasn't heated. It wasn't mean-spirited. And that's one of the things that Jesse always said, in this church, we can have disagreements, but unless it's a first-order issue, we're going to do it peaceably and lovingly. We're going to debate these things. And if we become convinced that one's right, then we'll go with it, but until then. And so these debates happened to such a degree that, apparently more and more people were kind of joining the Baptist side on this. And there'd already been one time before there'd been a similar thing happen in this church under John Spilsbury. We'll come back to him. And he had left in, I think it was 34, and started a church, the oldest Reformed Baptist church in the world at Wapping, which we'll come back to the Wapping church soon. But this is happening again. And now another group leaves the church because it's just agreed. We don't agree on this. And we're worried it could become divisive. So let's just choose to separate and love one another, support one another, and bid each other well and support each other. And that's what they did. They really separated as churches, but with no animosity or acrimony. It was just a peaceful thing of, hey, we just disagree enough on these things. Maybe it is time for us to have 2 congregations. And there was a need for more and more congregations because London's a huge city and there weren't that many Baptist churches. So it actually worked well to say, well, we'll just move several miles toward downtown, London, and we'll be there, It's interesting, though. Jesse and Knollys stay very much in contact through the years, for the next couple of years, very much supporting each other. And in fact, 2 years later, when Henry Jesse becomes convinced that credo baptism is correct and argues that his church should also become a credo Baptist church, he asked Hanserd Knollys to be the one to baptize him. So Knollys comes back to baptize him in his congregation. So again, we shouldn't see this as a split that was in any way nasty. This was just people lovingly agreeing that it might be best for the mission of both churches to be in separate places and work together. So that's what they did. All right, having said all of that, during this same period of time, as Cromwell eventually takes control of the government, because Cromwell knows Wheelwright and Wheelwright knows Knollys, he gets the opportunity to work in government. He becomes the head or the director of the Office of Customs and Tariffs, which was a pretty important office in that day. Most governments funded themselves off tariffs and customs. And so it was a pretty serious office to have. And he held that office for a couple of years until he got to the point where he felt it was interfering with his ministry, and his ministry had to come first. So he then resigned that position. For a couple of years after he left, by the way, he wasn't the lead preacher there for a short time in the church. He was preaching where he could, but I think it was 46, he actually starts the church. It officially starts as a church, and what we call the Broken Wharf Church today, it wasn't called that at the time. It was just a Baptist church. They would often say, name it by where it meets. Like the Broken Wharf Church, it's called that because it met at the Broken Wharf, which the Broken Wharf is the oldest, or one of the 2 or 3 oldest wharfs on all the Thames River through London. And it was called Broken Wharf. There's a debate on this, by the way, either because for a while it broke, the wharf itself broke and fell into the Thames River, and they had to repair it. And people said, oh, you know where that broken wharf is. And that's kind of how it began to be known. Or some people say, no, it's where ships were repaired. And so all you saw were kind of broken down ships that would pull in there to be repaired. And so they called it the Broken Wharf. Whatever the reason, that church is called that because that's where it met, was in the Broken Wharf district of London. But that's not where they first met. They first met in 1646 at St. Mary's Axe. And I think it makes sense to us. He had started a school there. He knew the people who rented space there. He knew that location very well. And so he had a lot of influence in them going back there and starting. In fact, I mentioned to you a moment ago, St. Helens of Bishopgate. He opened his church in a building literally right next door to St. Helens. At that time, they called it the Great St. Helens Church. And he opened right next to it, which tells you really how old that building is, because no other building around it is original. It's the only building left from that era. All the buildings that would have been there in that day around it are gone. And some of the most spectacular skyscrapers in the financial district, like the Gherkin, are there now. But again, that's where he opened his church. And it's reported by those ministers at St. Helens that within a few months, 1,000 people were gathering at this little upstart church. 1,000 people. Spectacular in that day. And began really a boom of Baptist churches in London for the next about 20 years or so. But anyway, so during that period before they end up at Broken Wharf, when they're meeting where they can before they get the property at St. Mary's Axe, he's preaching in churchyards. He's basically saying, don't go into the Anglican church. Stay out here and I'll preach to you. And you might be surprised to know the authorities took note of this and were not happy. And so he was arrested. And they had to have a reason. It's not illegal to preach in a churchyard. The reason that they listed was that he was preaching things that were unorthodox, not according to the Church of England. And so anyway, he went before wasn't the Church of England, I meant to say, against the Westminster Committee, I should say. This is during the Westminster phase. And he goes before a subcommittee of Parliament who questioned him. And there's a 30-member subcommittee, and Knowles famously said, well, rather than defend myself, I think what I'll do is I'll just re-preach the sermon, and you all decide if I say anything offensive. And so he took the opportunity to preach his entire sermon to these 30 members of Parliament, and they were so moved by the sermon at the end that they told him he was allowed to go free, and they threatened the constable with arrest if he ever bothered him again. That must have been some sermon, but he was allowed to go free. Things like this happen several times. He goes to Southwark at the invitation of a minister there to preach around this same time, and they'd been spreading around town that he was an Anabaptist, and so people show up at the church with rocks in their pockets, and when he begins preaching, they start trying to stone him out of the pulpit. And so the constable comes, of course, like, what's going on here? They arrest him again, and he goes through the process, legal process that shows that he did nothing wrong, he said nothing wrong. And so the city, the government of Southwark said, basically, you have a license, you can preach here anytime you want. He and Kiffin both received that. And so a lot of amazing things were happening during this time, dangerous things as well. He was in jail many times for 16 months, 18 months, 20 months. I think when he was 85, he was thrown in jail for a year and a half, which at 85 in those days, it's amazing to have made it to 85, right? Your health usually wouldn't be very good. So again, in all this, we see that that he's bold, he's willing to preach, he's willing to pay the price, and all of that. Well, they end up leaving St. Mary's Axe. They go to 2 or 3 other locations, which are really hard to identify today. I mean, we know the general areas they're in, but not much more. And then he went down to the Broken Wharf, and the Broken Wharf is on the River Thames, as we said a minute ago. If you take where the original JLJ church was, it's across the Thames, so it's like on the opposite side from what we think of at that time as the main part of London. And so he's moved back across into the main part of London, or at least more that way with the Broken Wharf. And that's where most of these church plants ended up being. In Wapping, that's on the other side again. And they're just kind of spreading out along the wharf. And by the way, the reason I think the reason the wharfs were so popular with starting churches were, you could use warehouse spaces, you could use anything. You didn't have to pay much to rent them if it was not a work day. And in this day, on the Lord's Day, people didn't work for the most part, you know. So generally speaking, many warehouses would be empty, and you could come in for almost nothing and rent these spaces. And so it's reported that the Broken Wharf location, wherever that was, the location in Broken Wharf could have 1,000 people easily gather. And it was probably the biggest space any of these churches had to gather. We'll come back to that in just a moment. I want to say, before we move on, there's a lot of interesting stories that happen in the life of Hanserd Knollys. I already mentioned the time going before Parliament, preaching your sermon, and then they threatened to arrest the jailer. It's almost like stuff you read about in the book of Acts, you know, where God intervened so powerfully. But there's another story that was amazing. It was obviously not uncommon to get sick, to die from what we consider common things today. I mean, we all know you can die from the flu or a cold, things like that. But it was much more common back then, obviously, for those things to happen, for them to set up a pneumonia and maybe you wouldn't live. And in fact, when one of the great outbreaks of the plague happened in London, he and his wife both got sick, and she didn't make it. And he prayed diligently for her to recover, and she did not. And he did recover. In fact, many of the men came there and prayed over him, anointed him with oil, and did as it says in the book of James, which we talked about early in this semester, and he survived. A little later that year, a young kind of upstart leading figure in the Baptist movement got very sick. And his name was Benjamin Keach, one of the most important early Baptists. And we'll come back to him in the course of our studies. But Keach got very ill, and every doctor said, yeah, he's not going to make it. He's not going to make it. Thomas Crosby was Keach's son-in-law and an early historian of Baptists. He wrote the history of the English Baptists. And here's what Thomas Crosby records happened. So I'm just going to read it. This is from Michael A.G. Haken's book on Kiffin, Knowles, and Keach. Here's what happened. That same year that this assembly took place in London, so a gathering of the people, Knowles was involved in a fascinating event that is recorded by Thomas Crosby in the history of the English Baptists. Crosby's father-in-law was Benjamin Keach, who was taken ill in 1689 and was expected to die. But Crosby records that Reverend Mr. Hanserd Knowles, seeing his then dying friend and brother in the gospel near to all appearance expiring, betook himself to prayer, and in an earnest and very extraordinary manner begged that God would spare this man, and add unto his days the time he granted to his servant Hezekiah. And as soon as he had ended his prayer, he said, Brother Keach, I shall be in heaven before you, and quickly after left him. Knollys would die 2 years later. Keach lived another 15 years, dying in 1704, the same span of years God had added to the life of Hezekiah, according to Isaiah 38. That's an amazing, amazing thing, you know. Some would say amazing coincidence, but it is an amazing thing. And I think Knollys understood his generation was the generation that was there at the first confession, you know, 1644. By the way, Knollys didn't sign 1644. He was not really a well-known and respected Baptist in 1644. He had just left the JLJ church. He's just kind of getting established. So he either wasn't invited or didn't want to participate, whatever the case. He didn't sign 1644, but when they did the revised edition in 1646, he did sign it. And he is one of only two men who signed the first London Baptist Confession, the revised edition, and the second London Baptist Confession of Faith. That's he and William Kiffin. And so these were the elder statesmen. I mean, there's just no question about it. You can imagine when we're talking about this couple of years before he died, he and Kiffin would have had an esteem that really no one else would have had, as these men who had been there through, I mean, all of this. That they were there before there were even Baptist churches. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, we can argue that there may have been Baptist doctrine being preached, but the first Baptist church at Wapping's the mid-30s, 1630s. The JLJ church wasn't officially a Baptist church until the 40s, the 1640s. So these men were ministering before there even were identifiable Baptists in London. They were part of the first assemblies of the first confession, and they were there in the second confession and really helped see it through to completion. And they were the men training up this next generation of pastors and had seen the explosion of the churches. I mean, going from, 7 congregations in the first confession to where just a couple of decades later, there's over 100 congregations that are involved in the second confession. An extraordinary time, and these men were highly respected, but men like Knollys knew that, I mean, we've got to be careful. We can't say God needed, God is going to be fine without Benjamin Keach, but he believed God was going to use Benjamin Keach for great things. And so in their praying, he was praying, spare this man. He's important to our work. He's got an ability that is rare. And it certainly was that God had given him. And Keach became obviously one of the most important Baptists. I mean, in fact, if you just think about it, here are like the original guys, and Keach's name is added to this book with them, right? So it tells you the importance of Keach. Many other important men. We're going to talk about many of them along the way. Hercules Collins and John Spilsbury, so many great men. We're going to talk about them over the next several weeks. But this man was special. Benjamin Keach was special. And he recognized that, and he believed it was God's will for him to live, and so he prayed according to what he believed God's will was, which was for him to live and be of use, and he certainly was. All right, I want to mention also, you'll notice in the confession there is another name, and that is of Robert Steed. And what we can say about Robert Steed will take about 3 minutes. We don't know much about him. And this is often the case. There are many interesting figures that appear in the history of other men that you think, I'd like to know more about that guy. And as far as we know nothing hardly. I mean, they weren't written about. They weren't, I think you can imagine Knollys was the great pastor of the Broken Wharf Church, and Steed was his associate pastor. I don't want to put it that way, but he was an elder, a fellow elder. But I mean, Knollys was the person people were talking about. And so Steed kind of slinks a little bit behind him in his shadow and isn't as well known. There's not much written about him. What is written about him is interesting. He was a pastor, obviously, with him at that church when the Second Confession was signed. He continues on and becomes the lead elder. It seems like at the time of Knollys' death, Steed is the only other elder there. So he becomes kind of the lead elder, and they begin to recruit some new elders. And so for a while, it's kind of like Steed is the main guy at that church, but he only lives to a few more years after that, maybe I guess I should say about 10 years after that, I believe. And I don't think that church at Broken Wharf ever held the same esteem after Knollys that it did while he was alive. But I think Steed was a good minister, a solid minister, but there was a controversy in his lifetime that is what he's known for. There was a debate about worship. You're going to be shocked to hear this, right? There was a debate about worship in that day and on what music is appropriate for worship. And, the more things change, the more they stay the same, I guess. But the debate then was, are you allowed to use hymns? Right? People are beginning to write good hymns. There had been some bad hymns written along the way, as there always is, but there were some good hymns being written, and people were like, what would be the objection to using this hymn? And some people, based on the regulative principle, were saying, nowhere in Scripture does it authorize us to sing hymns. And we'd say, well, wait a minute, there is singing hymns and spiritual songs and psalms. But they would say, well, no, you're misinterpreting that. And there was a lot of debate on all of this. And there was real concern that what we were doing in singing hymns was elevating men's words, right? In other words, we should be singing the Psalms, the Word of God. Or if you want to make a set, 1 Corinthians 13 to music or something, okay, we'll sing it. But we shouldn't be singing the words of, Isaac Watts or something like that, right? Because again, or even Luther, right? Luther was a great hymn writer. We shouldn't sing Luther's words. They're not inspired. And so this was a big debate at this time. And it's interesting because in some places it was very heated. Keach was very devout on, yes, hymns, songs, psalms. If they glorify God, sing them, right? We're to be a singing people. And I think that would be very much what Luther would have argued. Luther said, hey, music's only second to the Word of God in terms of our worship. But some people are saying no. So actually within the Broken Wharf Church, early on, Knollys put out a thing where he agreed with Keach. And he said, yeah, if it's a good song, if it's theologically sound, if there's nothing against it, and it's an easy way to teach and learn theology, why would we not do it, And then he found out Steed didn't agree with him, right? Steed was like, oh, I don't agree at all. I think we should only be doing psalms. And so there was a bit of a disagreement between these two pastors, these two elders of this church, but it never got heated between them. And I think it has a lot to do with Knollys kind of stepping back on this issue for some reason. I don't know if he didn't think it was central or what. But after Knollys dies, Steed becomes very hot in this battle. I mean, he really goes in, doubles down on it, and goes to war against like Keach. And there are real divided lines between many of those early Baptists over this issue. Interestingly enough, the congregations that were against using hymns, within a few generations they were using them too. I'm not sure if that's an indication that over time the better argument for hymns won, or they might have said, yeah, well, of course compromise will eventually set in, I don't know. But whatever the case, it was an interesting debate. But that's what we know Steed best for, is that we know that he also was involved in some of the editing of the Second Confession, and as was of course Knollys. He was a leading figure in establishing it. And just to remind you once more, to circle back around, much of the point of that was to say, hey, we want to make it clear to the Westminster Assembly and to our Presbyterian brothers and whomever else, congregational brothers, we're not very far from you guys. There's a few issues that we differ a little bit on, but on all of the orthodox issues of doctrine of God, doctrine of scriptures, just go down the list, we're in agreement, so much so that we can take your wording pretty much, right? I mean, I think Rinhan says they took the language of the Westminster through the sieve of the Savoy, which is pretty much what they did. But they just said, look, we'll use your language. We don't need to reinvent. You may remember the language from the preface. We don't need to clog religion with new expressions, right? It's already well said by our Presbyterian brothers and our Congregationalist brothers. And in fact, I tried to make this point before. Matthew Emerson, I think, is who says this, but they really saw themselves as simply Congregationalists who believed in, credo baptism, baptismal Congregationalists. And so they didn't see a reason to really change things too much. So Broken Wharf, when we come to the Second Confession, this is the last thing I need to say here. When they come to the Second Confession, it seems to be pushed in terms of we need to do this, we need to get this done. It seems to be pushed more by the Petty France Church. We'll come back to the Petty France Church. But it seems to be pushed mostly by the Petty France Church. And that'd be like Nehemiah Cox and some of those other great men we've talked about before. They're the ones saying we really need to get a new confession. We need to get this done. I mean, they'd already been working on it, but we need to get it kind of published and then eventually sign on to it. You may remember they didn't do that for a long time because of persecution. But when they chose where we're going to meet, they said we need to meet at Broken Wharf. We need to have the gathering of the 100+ churches, and I think 70 churches actually showed up. They just couldn't all make it. Again, imagine some of these churches were like in Ireland. Imagine the cost to travel in that day and the hardship of traveling. But they represented those churches. Some of those churches gave fellow churches that were going the ability to represent them by proxy. And whatever the case, as they get there, there's this gathering of the churches. And the place it makes most sense to do it is at Broken Wharf, where they have a good amount of space. It's also one of the oldest churches, one of the most respected churches. The other most respected churches like Wapping didn't have the space. And so it just made sense to gather at the Broken Wharf. And that's where these men gathered, and they went over this document, and they agreed to this document, and they signed their names to this document, and put it into print, and then continued to gather. They would gather once a year after that. In fact, he only got to gather for Knollys for 2 more, 689, and I think I can't remember if he died right after or right before the one in 93, I think it was. Let me see if I got that in my notes here. But whatever the case, he got to go to a couple more of them, and I guess it's 91. So I guess he got to go to 2 more, and I think not long after that last one is when he got sick and he passed away. But one of the last major influences, like I said, of the early Baptist days, one of those guys you could go to and he could tell you what it was like under William Laud. You know, what was it like before the Revolution? What was it like under King Charles I? He could tell you. He lived it, you know. He could tell you stories about going to America and getting kicked out. I mean, all these amazing stories. And he knew some of the key players. He knew people like Cromwell. He knew people like William Vane. He knew these men. And it's amazing how some of these lives are involved in so many major points of history, you know, historical events. And he's one of them. And so anyway, with that, I bring my points to a close. If anybody has any questions, I'll try to answer.